The wind swept across the dry plains, carrying with it the smell of dust and old wood from the corrals. The ranch stood quiet under the hot sun, its fences stretching long and straight into the open land. Somewhere in the stillness a crow cawed, the sound echoing like a warning in the emptiness. Life in the West was never gentle, and this land demanded more than it gave. Out here, secrets had a way of surfacing, no matter how hard folks tried to bury them. She sat against the rough bark of a tree at the edge of the ranch yard, her hands clutching a broken plank of wood as if it were the only thing between her and the world. Her hair hung in tangled strands across her dirt-streaked face, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and defiance. She looked like she had been running, chased down by something far bigger than herself. Her breathing was quick, but she didn't make a sound. Every muscle in her body was braced, ready for whatever was coming next. The man standing a few paces away was no stranger to silence. His boots were planted firm in the dust, his shadow stretching long in the late afternoon sun. The brim of his hat cast a sharp line across his face, but his eyes never left her. He was a rancher by trade, a man of the land hardened by years under the sun. His shirt clung to him, the fabric stiff with sweat and dust. A red bandana hung loosely at his neck, and his revolver rested heavy at his side. He looked at her the way a man looks at a wild animal that's been cornered, not sure whether to reach out or to back away. No one knew for sure what had brought her here. Some said she came down from the northern trails, escaping a past she couldn't shake. Others whispered she was hiding from men who wouldn't stop hunting her. Out here in the West, stories were currency, and rumors traveled faster than the wind. But standing there, clutching that rough piece of wood against her chest, she looked less like a story and more like a riddle carved deep into the desert itself. He had only meant to test her, to see if her courage matched the sharpness in her eyes. He had told her to strip away the lies, the games, the masks she wore like armor. His voice had carried the weight of command, the kind men didn't often question in these parts. She had obeyed, though her face had flushed with something more than heat. And then, when she reached for the plank leaning against the tree, the board slipped and fell with a thud that cut through the silence like a gunshot. The sound froze him where he stood. His hand twitched toward his revolver, though no enemy stood in sight. He wasn't the kind of man who startled easily, but there was something about the way she clutched that wood, the way her eyes locked on his, that made the world feel suddenly unsteady. It wasn't the board itself that rattled him, it was what it revealed. In that single moment, something shifted between them, something neither of them could name. The sun burned lower on the horizon, painting the land in a harsh glow. The ranch stretched behind him, its barns and corrals standing like sentinels against the wide open plain. Beyond that, the wilderness waited, endless and untamed. This was a land where law came on horseback, where justice was measured in bullets and where a man's word was as sharp as steel. Yet here, in the quiet space between them, the rules of the West felt different, like they had stepped into a story neither of them had chosen, but both of them had to finish. Her lips trembled as she drew a breath, but no words came. He studied her, every detail etched into his mind, the dirt smeared on her arms, the trembling in her hands, the stubborn fire in her gaze. She was not like the women he had known in town, the ones who spoke with soft voices and careful manners. This woman carried scars that went deeper than skin. Whatever road had led her here, it had been paved with struggle and shadow. And yet she sat tall, gripping that broken board as though it were a shield of iron. The man's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure if he admired her for her boldness, or resented her for stirring something restless inside him. He had built his life on order and control, on making sure his land and his herd were tended without weakness. But now, facing her, he felt the cracks in that foundation. She hadn't come looking for him, yet here she was. And deep down, he knew that fate had a way of throwing people together for reasons that only became clear later. The silence stretched long, heavy with all the words unspoken. The horse behind him stamped its hoof, breaking the stillness for a heartbeat. He turned his head slightly, the brim of his hat shifting just enough to reveal the tension in his eyes. When he looked back at her, something had hardened in his expression, as though he had made up his mind. But before he could speak, she shifted the board in her arms and let out a sound, a small broken gasp that carried more weight than 100 words. The air seemed to tighten around them. He felt it in his chest, the same way he felt the charge in the air before a storm. Somewhere beyond the ranch, a dog barked, its voice faint but urgent. He wanted to ask her who she was, what she was running from, why she had come here, but the questions caught in his throat, because in that moment he realized he already knew. She wasn't just another wanderer looking for shelter. She was a storm, and she had brought it straight to his land. The board lay heavy in her hands, her knuckles white around its edges. His boots shifted in the dirt, slow and deliberate, as if each step toward her carried the weight of a decision that couldn't be undone. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. The only sound was the whisper of the wind against the dry earth. And then, just as his shadow reached her, the board slipped again, falling against the ground with a hollow thud. The rancher froze, this time not from surprise but from what he saw beneath it. Something that had been hidden in plain sight, something that changed everything. The kind of truth that a man couldn't walk away from, no matter how much he wanted to. His hand hovered near his gun, not because he meant to draw it, but because instinct told him the moment was about to break. The West had a way of demanding choices, and he knew his was standing right in front of him. The land held its breath. The sun sank lower and the shadows stretched longer. She raised her eyes to meet his, and in them he saw both fear and defiance, pain and strength. Whatever came next, it would not be simple. The board had fallen, and with it the thin line between past and present, between danger and safety, between him and her. He knew then that nothing about this encounter was an accident. It was the beginning of something neither of them could stop, and as the silence deepened, the West itself seemed to wait, as though the land understood that a story had just begun, one that would test every boundary they thought they knew. He told her to strip away the falsehoods, and she had. But what lay revealed was more dangerous than either of them had imagined. The board was on the ground now, and the truth it carried was too heavy to ignore. Would he pick it up, or would he walk away? That question hung in the air, unanswered, as the rancher stood frozen at the edge of a choice that could change both their lives forever. The board lay at her side now, half buried in the dust, but neither of them looked at it. Their eyes held on each other as if the weight of the whole ranch, the whole desert beyond, had shifted to rest between them. The rancher felt his throat dry up, though it wasn't from the sun or the dust. He had seen men ride into gunfights without blinking, had watched storms tear fences apart, and had lost cattle to wolves. But none of those moments had tied him up inside the way this one did. The woman shifted slightly, her bare arms tightening around her knees. She was trembling, though her face worked hard to hide it. Something about her grip on that piece of wood told him she wasn't just protecting herself. She was holding back something else, something she wasn't ready to let out. And that unsettled him more than anything, because out here in the West, folks carried secrets like sidearms, close to their chest and heavy enough to kill. He crouched slowly, boots scraping the dirt, trying to make his voice steady. "Where'd you come from?" he asked, though his tone carried less curiosity than it did command. She blinked, her eyes darting toward the horizon before snapping back to him. No answer came, just silence, thick and stretched like a rope ready to break. Behind them, the horse pawed the earth, restless. The sound echoed through the yard, mingling with the creak of a loose board on the fence. The rancher glanced back for only a second, but when he looked at her again, he caught the faintest shift in her posture, as though she had been ready to bolt. He didn't call her on it. He just let the silence breathe, heavy and charged. He had lived alone on this land for longer than he cared to count. The ranch had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. Hard years and hard hands had built it, and hard choices had kept it standing. He wasn't a man who took strangers lightly, and especially not a stranger who showed up desperate, shaken, and silent. But there was something in her eyes that kept him from turning his back, something that told him she hadn't come here by chance. The sky shifted overhead, clouds trailing slow across the sun. He felt the change in the air, that strange weight that came before dusk. His hand brushed against the revolver at his side, more out of habit than need, but it reminded him of what kind of land he stood on. This wasn't the East, where a sheriff's office kept order with papers and stamps. This was the frontier. Out here, truth and justice were written in sweat, steel, and the grit of whoever stood longest. The woman let out a shaky breath, and when she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, almost breaking. "You don't want me here." Her words weren't a question. They were a statement, flat and worn, like she had said them before to others who had turned her away. He studied her a moment, letting the weight of the words hang. He could have said yes. He could have told her to get up, take her feet to the nearest road and not look back. That was the easier path, the safer one. But the truth was, something in her tone dug under his skin, the same way a thorn finds its way through a glove. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned his weight on one knee and reached for the board she had dropped. She flinched, her grip tightening on her knees, but he only turned the wood over in his hand. It was nothing more than a splintered plank worn with age, but he looked at it like it carried a story he couldn't yet read. "You carrying something you can't drop?" he asked finally, his voice low. She closed her eyes as if the question itself hurt, and then shook her head. Not in refusal, but in surrender. The rancher stood again, tall and silent, staring out past the fences. The land stretched wide and empty, but he knew it was never truly empty. Somewhere out there, someone might be looking for her. Someone dangerous enough to make her run this far, to leave her broken and clutching scraps of wood like they could save her life. The thought tightened his chest. He had seen this before in different shapes. Travelers who came through town with eyes that never stopped searching. Families who had lost everything to raiders or debt collectors. Men who wore desperation like a second skin. But this woman was different. Her silence wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something sharp-edged. The wind picked up, pushing the dust across the yard. He turned back to her. "If you're gonna stay here," he said, voice firm, "you need to tell me what you're running from." Her head lifted, and her eyes burned into his. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, just when he thought she might break the silence, the sound of a gunshot cracked in the distance. It was faint, carried over the open land, but enough to snap the air tight between them. His hand moved fast to the revolver at his side, his body turning instinctively toward the sound. The horse reared slightly, snorting, pulling against the reins. He squinted at the horizon, the dry heat making the distance blur. Another shot followed, then silence. The woman's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling as her arms tightened around her legs. Her lips parted, but again no words came. He didn't need them. The fear in her eyes told him enough. Whoever had fired those shots wasn't just out on a hunt or target practice. They were close, and they were connected to her. He kept his stance firm, but inside he felt the shift. His land had always been a place of control, a place where he set the rules and the world listened. But with her here, with that board on the ground and gunfire on the wind, the ranch no longer felt like his own. It felt like a stage being set, and he wasn't sure whether he was the hunter or the hunted. The woman pressed her forehead against her knees, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. He stepped closer, boots crunching against the dirt, and caught only fragments, pleas, apologies, warnings, words that hinted at shadows darker than the night sky that would soon fall over them. He didn't press her, not yet. He knew the West had its own way of forcing truths out. But as he looked down at her, fragile and fierce all at once, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had already stepped into a story bigger than himself, the kind of story that twisted lives together whether they wanted it or not. The board lay at their feet, and the silence between them grew heavy again, cut only by the faint rustle of the wind. Far out on the horizon, a figure on horseback moved briefly against the light before vanishing into the haze. His jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. The West had a way of circling back on a man, testing him, pushing him into corners where no easy choice existed. And tonight, with the shadows stretching long and the memory of gunfire echoing across the plains, he realized the choice had already arrived. He just hadn't spoken it yet. The woman lifted her head, her eyes searching his face with a look that carried both dread and hope. The rancher held her gaze, steady and unblinking, even as the weight of the unseen pressed harder around them. He didn't speak. Neither did she, because some truths didn't need words to be heard. And as the last of the sun sank behind the horizon, leaving them in the half-light of evening, the board still on the ground, the sound of approaching hooves broke the silence once more. The rancher froze, caught between the woman's burning stare and the shadow growing closer on the land, knowing the night was about to demand more from him than he had ever given before. The sound of hooves grew sharper against the dry earth, steady and deliberate. The rancher stayed rooted in place, one hand resting near his revolver, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. The woman clutched her arms tighter around her knees, her whole body tensing with every beat of the approaching horse. The ranch had known riders before, neighbors or drifters passing through, but this was different. This had weight to it. Whoever was coming was not riding by chance. Dust lifted in a thin line out beyond the fence, the blur of a rider slowly taking shape. The rancher's heart pounded slower than the rhythm of hooves, but heavier. He turned his head slightly, enough to catch the woman's gaze. She shook her head faintly, almost imperceptibly, her lips parting as if to say something, then closing again. He read the fear in her eyes, clear as a gun barrel. She knew who this was. The horse slowed near the far gate, the rider pulling hard on the reins. The animal reared before settling, and the rider scanned the yard in silence. The rancher recognized the look instantly, the watchful sweep of someone who expected trouble and was willing to stir it up if needed. The brim of the man's hat shadowed his face, but even at a distance the sharpness of his posture spoke of authority. A gun rested easy at his side, too easy for a man who wasn't planning to use it. The rancher felt the familiar prickle along his neck, the one that came before fights or storms. His land had been quiet for years, his struggles kept to cattle, fences, and the elements. But tonight that calm felt broken, and it all traced back to the woman at the tree. She had lowered her head again, her fingers digging into her arms until her knuckles went pale. He wanted to demand the truth, to drag the answers out of her then and there, but something in him held back. Maybe it was the way her whole body seemed braced for punishment, or maybe it was the flicker of fire he had seen earlier in her eyes. Whatever it was, he knew pressing her now would only push her further into silence. The rider dismounted slowly, boots hitting the ground with purpose. He tied his horse at the fence and began to walk, dust swirling with each step. His stride carried the weight of a man who had come for something, or someone, and wouldn't leave without it. The rancher's hand flexed near his revolver, though he didn't draw. Not yet. The West had its share of violence, but it also had its own quiet code. A man didn't shoot until he knew exactly why he had to. "Evenin'," the rider called, his voice steady, cutting across the distance like a blade. He tipped his hat slightly, but his eyes never left the yard. "Quiet out here tonight." The rancher didn't answer right away. He studied the man, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his fingers hovered near his belt. Then he finally spoke. "Quiet's how I like it." The rider's eyes flicked to the tree where the woman sat. She shifted, curling tighter into herself. The movement was small, but the rider caught it. His lips curled faintly, though it wasn't a smile. "You've got company," he said. The rancher didn't glance at her. He kept his gaze on the stranger, steady as a fence post. "Company finds its way out here sometimes," he replied. The rider took another step, the sound of his boots crunching the dirt loud in the stillness. "That one there," he nodded toward her. "She don't look like company. She looks like trouble." The woman let out a sharp breath, her head snapping up, eyes wide and burning. For a moment her fear cracked and anger flared through. "Don't listen to him," she rasped, her voice raw but cutting. "He's not what he says." The rancher turned his head slightly, enough to catch her expression. The rider's eyes darkened. "You hush now," he said flatly, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who expected obedience. The rancher straightened, his shoulders broadening as his hand shifted closer to his holster. The distance between words and violence had grown razor thin. He didn't know who the stranger was, didn't know the full truth of the woman's story. But he knew one thing with certainty. No man had the right to step onto his land and demand silence from another, not without reason that held water. The woman's voice trembled as she pushed herself up slightly, her hands gripping the bark of the tree behind her. "He's lying," she said, the words spilling fast now. "He'll twist it all, please. Don't let him take me." The rancher's jaw tightened, his mind turning hard. He didn't know her past, didn't know why she was running or what she carried. But the sight of her clinging to that tree, torn between fear and defiance, told him this wasn't just about right or wrong. This was about survival. The rider stopped, boots firm in the dust. His hand rested on his belt, not yet on his gun, but close enough. "She belongs with me," he said evenly. "Best step aside, rancher." "This don't have to get messy." The silence stretched, the air sharp as broken glass. The rancher felt the weight of the moment pressing on him, the choice already forming. He didn't know the whole truth, but he knew one thing for certain. This land was his, and no outsider made demands on it. But before he could speak, the woman broke. She pushed off the tree, stumbling forward, her voice ragged. "No," she shouted, the word torn from her throat. "I'm not going back." Both men froze. Her sudden burst had cracked the stillness wide open. The rancher's hand gripped his revolver tighter, while the rider's eyes blazed with something between rage and recognition. The woman staggered closer to the rancher, her hands out as if to beg for protection, her face streaked with dust and desperation. He caught her movement from the corner of his eye, but his focus stayed locked on the rider. The rider drew a breath, steadying himself, his hand finally brushing against the handle of his gun. "You don't understand, rancher," he said, voice low, coiled. "She's not who you think. She's dangerous." The words hung in the air, heavier than lead. The rancher's mind turned, questions clawing for answers. Dangerous. Was it true? Or was it a chain the rider meant to fasten back around her neck? The woman's voice cracked, her words tumbling in a rush. "He'll say anything, please. You don't know what he's done." Her voice quivered, but her eyes held a raw fire that hadn't been there before. The rancher saw it, and it unsettled him as much as it steadied him. The West was filled with liars and lawmen, saints and sinners, and sometimes they all wore the same face. He had learned long ago that truth wasn't something handed over easy. It had to be dug out, fought for, wrestled into the open. The stranger took another step, and the rancher's revolver cleared leather in a single motion, the barrel gleaming under the fading light. The rider stopped dead, his hand halting an inch from his own weapon. The yard held its breath. The woman clung to the rancher's arm, her nails biting through his sleeve, her whole body shaking, but her eyes stayed fixed on the rider, burning with a mix of hatred and fear. The silence stretched long, broken only by the restless snort of the horse at the fence. The rancher stood between them now, the tension coiled tighter than a rattler ready to strike. He didn't fire, didn't speak, didn't move. He knew one wrong step would ignite the storm already circling above them. The sun slipped lower, painting the land in shadows. Out on the horizon, another faint line of dust rose, thin but certain. More riders. The rancher's heart sank heavier. This wasn't just one man. This was the start of something larger, something that had already found its way to his land. And as the woman pressed closer, whispering words he barely caught, words of warning, of promises, of fear, he realized the choice he faced was no longer about whether to trust her. It was about how much of his life, his land, and his blood he was willing to risk for a truth still buried in the dust. The board lay forgotten by the tree, half covered in shadow, but it was not forgotten in his mind. Because whatever had been hidden, whatever had been revealed when it fell, was part of the storm rolling toward them. And the West, in all its ruthless silence, was about to test just how much a man could hold before breaking. The last of the daylight was slipping fast, the horizon turning from copper to deep purple, and the ranch yard seemed to grow smaller with every breath. The woman's grip on the rancher's arm was tight, desperate, her body trembling, but her eyes never strayed from the rider across the dust. The stranger stood frozen, hand hovering close to his revolver, eyes sharp, waiting for a break in the tension. And then there was the sound, the low, steady thunder of more hooves rolling across the open land. The rancher's jaw hardened. He had been in plenty of tight spots before, but this one was different. It wasn't just about him anymore. His land, his cattle, his life had always been his to protect. But now there was this woman, raw and wounded, clutching him like he was her last anchor. He hadn't chosen this fight, but it had found him, and it was closing in fast. Dust rose on the far ridge, and the outlines of riders appeared against the fading sky. 4, maybe 5, moving in a straight line toward the ranch. The rancher's gut twisted. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was planned. The stranger in the yard was the front edge, and the others were the hammer coming down. The woman's breathing quickened, her words tumbling out in a whisper that only he could hear. "Don't let them take me. They'll kill me, I swear it." Her voice cracked, but the fire in her eyes burned hotter than ever. It was not just fear, it was defiance, the kind that came from a soul that had fought too long to give in now. The rancher didn't answer. His revolver stayed trained on the man before him, but his mind raced. He couldn't fight 5 men alone, not out in the open yard. The fences offered no cover, and the barn was too far. The only edge he had was the ground he stood on, his ground, and he had no intention of giving it up easy. The stranger shifted his stance, his lips curling in a thin smile. "Best hand her over now," he said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "Save yourself the trouble." The rancher's voice came low and even. "You rode onto my land armed and uninvited. You don't make the rules here." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're protecting. She's got blood on her hands, more than you can imagine. You think you're saving her, but you're only dragging yourself into her mess." The woman's head snapped up, her voice rising sharp through the tension. "Liar!" The word rang out fierce and broken. She stepped half a pace forward, though her hand still clung to the rancher's sleeve. "Don't believe him, please." The rancher kept his stance solid, though the words cut at him. Both voices rang true in different ways, and he had no proof either way. All he had was instinct, and instinct was telling him this fight ran deeper than the dust on his boots. The thunder of hooves grew louder. The other riders were closing in, their silhouettes clearer with each passing second. The rancher counted them again, 5, all armed. His heart beat steady, but his grip on the revolver tightened. He wasn't about to let strangers storm his land without resistance. The woman's body trembled against his arm, and he could feel her holding back the urge to bolt. He knew if she ran, they'd cut her down before she reached the trees. Staying close to him was her only chance, and maybe his only reason to fight. The stranger in the yard took another slow step forward. His hand brushed the handle of his gun, though he stopped short of drawing. His smile faded, replaced by a hard, cold expression. "You'll regret this," he said flatly. The rancher's voice stayed low, his words sharp. "Try me." The air between them snapped taut, ready to break with the smallest spark. And then the sound of the other riders filled the yard. The group reined in their horses at the edge of the fence line, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. They didn't call out, didn't move closer. They just sat their saddles watching, waiting. The rancher knew this tactic. He'd seen it before in cattle disputes and land feuds. It was intimidation, pure and simple. One man pressed in close while the others circled like wolves, ready to pounce if blood spilled. The woman's nails dug deeper into his sleeve. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They'll burn this place down just to get to me." Her words sent a chill through him. This wasn't just about her past. This was a storm that threatened to swallow his land, his life, everything he'd built. And yet, as the riders sat in the shadows, he felt something inside him harden. He had fought too long, bled too much to hand over what was his. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. The stranger studied him, eyes flicking between the revolver aimed steady at his chest, and the woman pressed close at the rancher's side. For a brief moment his expression softened, not in mercy but in calculation, as if he were weighing the risk of drawing now or waiting for the others to strike. The rancher caught the shift, and his jaw clenched tighter. Every second stretched long, the weight of the moment pressing down like thunderclouds ready to burst. The woman suddenly cried out, her voice breaking the silence. "Don't let them take me. You don't know what they'll do." Her words were raw, desperate, but laced with something else. Truth, or at least the kind of conviction that felt like truth. The rancher felt it in his bones. She wasn't just running, she was fighting for her life. The riders at the fence shifted in their saddles, the creak of leather sharp in the stillness. One of them called out, his voice rough. "You gonna drag this out all night, or are we finishing it?" The rancher didn't look at them. His revolver stayed fixed on the man before him. His voice came steady, calm as still water. "You set one boot closer and this ground drinks your blood first." The man stared at him long and hard. Then his lips curled again in that faint, humorless smile. "You're a stubborn fool," he said quietly. The rancher's eyes didn't waver. "Maybe, but I'm a stubborn fool who doesn't scare easy." The night settled deeper, the last of the light bleeding away. Shadows stretched long, wrapping the yard in darkness. The woman's breath came quick against his arm, her heart hammering so hard he could feel it through her grip. The riders outside the fence remained still, but their presence was a noose tightening around the ranch. The silence became unbearable, the kind that carried the taste of gunpowder before a shot was fired. The rancher's finger rested against the trigger, his body coiled like a spring. He knew the storm was about to break, and when it did, there would be no turning back. The woman whispered again, words trembling on her lips. "They'll kill us both." The rancher didn't answer. His eyes locked on the stranger, his breath steady, his decision already made. He wasn't about to surrender. Not her, not his land, not tonight. The riders shifted once more, and the sound of metal clinked faint in the dark. A signal. The rancher knew it well. The fight was seconds away, and as the wind whipped dust across the yard, as the horses snorted restless and the woman's grip tightened until it burned, the rancher stood frozen in that last breath of calm, the world holding still on the edge of chaos, waiting for the first spark that would ignite everything. The climax was not yet here, but it was coming, fast and unstoppable, with the force of the Wild West itself pressing down on them. The gunshot split the night. The stranger staggered back, clutching his arm, but the rancher did not lower his revolver. Dust swirled in the air, the echo rolling across the land like thunder. For one long second, the yard froze in silence, and then the riders at the fence jerked their reins. The horses shifted restless, and the tension cracked open like a whip. Another shot rang out, then another, and the rancher grabbed the woman by the arm, pulling her toward the porch. The boards rattled under their boots as bullets clipped the posts and splinters flew. She stumbled, nearly falling, but he held her steady, his own breath heavy in his chest. Behind them, the door slammed open, and the sound of a shotgun pumping filled the dark. His old ranch hand, silent until now, stepped forward and fired into the night, the blast booming across the yard. The riders pulled back, circling wide, their shouts rising, but they didn't push in. Not yet. They knew the rancher wasn't standing alone anymore, and that gave them pause. The stranger on the ground crawled to his knees, clutching his wound, and barked an order. The horses reared, dust rising again, and the men pulled away into the open land, their silhouettes fading into the dark. The yard went still. Smoke curled from the barrel of the shotgun, the smell of gunpowder heavy in the air. The woman dropped to her knees on the porch, her hands shaking, tears streaking down her cheeks. The rancher holstered his revolver but kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for any sign they might return. "They'll be back," she whispered, her voice raw. The rancher turned and crouched beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Maybe, but not tonight." His words came low, but there was strength in them, enough to quiet the storm inside her for a moment. The old ranch hand stepped forward, his face lined, his eyes tired but sharp. "We'll need to be ready. They ain't the kind to give up easy." The rancher nodded. He knew it too. This fight wasn't over just because the night had swallowed them. But for now, the ground was theirs. Inside the house, the woman sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup, though she couldn't bring herself to drink. Her eyes darted toward the window as if the riders might appear there at any second. The rancher leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face unreadable in the lantern light. Finally, she spoke. "You don't know what you've done by standing with me. Those men won't stop until they get what they came for." His gaze stayed steady. "Then let them come. This is my land. Nobody drives me off it." Her voice broke. "You don't understand. They're after me. Not your land, not your cattle. Me." For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the lantern chain. Then she lifted her eyes, and he saw the truth pouring out of her. She told him everything. How she had fled from men who wanted to use her for their own gain. How she had carried secrets that made her a target. And how she had been running for so long she no longer knew what peace felt like. The rancher listened, silent, his jaw tight. She had blood on her hands, yes, but not the way the stranger claimed. She had fought to survive in a world that gave her no mercy, and now that world had followed her to his door. When she finished, her head dropped, and the silence stretched heavy between them. Finally, the rancher stepped forward, placing a hand on the table. "You don't need to run anymore. You've got people standing with you now." Her eyes filled again, but this time with something softer, hope. The following days were restless. The riders did not return immediately, but the ranch carried the weight of waiting. Every creak of wood, every rustle of wind in the grass felt like a warning. The rancher and his hand took turns keeping watch, rifles ready, while the woman helped mend fences and care for the stock, though her hands often shook with the work. In that time, something unspoken grew between them. She began to see the ranch as more than just a hiding place. It was a home, a chance at the life she had always been denied. And the rancher, hardened by years of loneliness and labor, found himself drawn to her quiet strength, the way she fought even when the odds stood high against her. But he also knew the fight was not finished. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he found her standing near the edge of the corral, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She spoke without turning. "They'll come again. They'll bring more men. You shouldn't have to pay for my past." He stepped closer, his voice firm. "Your past doesn't scare me. What matters is where you're standing now." She finally looked at him, and in her gaze was something fragile yet unbreakable. For the first time in years, she believed she might belong somewhere. When the riders returned, it was at dawn. The sound of hooves woke the ranch like a storm rolling in. But this time the rancher was ready. He had called on neighbors in the days of waiting. Men who owed him favors, men who respected him. They rode in from nearby lands, rifles on their shoulders, standing beside him. The riders who had haunted the woman's steps found not a frightened pair hiding on a porch, but a line of ranchers, strong and unyielding, defending one of their own. The standoff stretched, words flying sharp and hot in the rising light, but no gun was drawn. The riders saw the strength gathered before them and knew the cost of pressing on would be too high. With curses and threats, they pulled back, the dust of their retreat catching the sun. The woman watched them go, her breath caught in her throat, her body trembling with the release of a fear she had carried for too long. When silence returned, broken only by the snort of horses and the creak of leather, she turned to the rancher. Her eyes shone with tears, but her lips trembled into a small, grateful smile. "You saved me," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, you saved yourself by standing tall. I just stood with you." The neighbors drifted back to their lands, the danger fading with the dust. The ranch grew quiet again, but it was not the same. The woman no longer looked over her shoulder at every sound. The rancher no longer felt the weight of loneliness pressing on his chest. They worked side by side, mending, planting, caring for the cattle, each day weaving their lives tighter together. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, the horizon painted with the fading sun, speaking of small things, sometimes in silence, sometimes in laughter. She found her hand steady at last, and he found his heart lighter than he had ever known. The land healed from the storm, and so did they. The woman, once hunted, found safety in roots she never thought she'd have. The rancher, once hardened, discovered that strength wasn't only in standing alone, but in choosing to stand with someone else. In the end, the West was still wild, still unforgiving, but in that small corner of it, peace had taken root. And it grew not from guns or land or power, but from the courage of two people who chose to fight not only against the darkness outside, but also for the chance of light within. The ranch stood tall under the open sky, a place no longer just of survival, but of belonging. And though the wind still carried the memory of riders on the horizon, it also carried the promise of something stronger: hope, freedom, and the quiet strength of a bond forged in fire and held fast in love.